In our last video, we were just discussing the nature of pleasure and its relationship to virtue and different types of character. And one of our conclusions there was about the connection between happiness and pleasure, that happiness involves pleasure. It is not necessarily a life of pleasure, because we need to be more subtle in how we understand what pleasure is. Pleasure is not just the bodily, physical pleasures that you immediately think of, but it's any activity that you enjoy. It's the enjoyment of an activity. And so what we saw was that happiness, to a certain extent, was enjoying the best pleasures. And we saw last time as well that in order to enjoy the best pleasures, you need to be a virtuous person. You need to be excellent at that kind of activity to actually enjoy it as a pleasure. And in class today, in this video, we're going to be looking at what are those pleasures that are most connected to happiness. Our kind of motivating question will be something like this. What are the best acts? What are the best kinds of acts that you can do that would be most connected to what happiness is, right? And so we're going back to this question of happiness. Well, here's this thing. That first, when you first think about it, when we look at the way we actually live our lives, we tend to think that maybe happiness is just chilling, hanging out, relaxing. Why? Because so much of our life is ordered towards that. If you look about the way that most of us sort of live our lives, we live for the weekend. We live for our leisure. But here's this important concept then, that this idea that we sort of live for our leisure. We talked about leisure a couple classes ago, that leisure is really the time that you do acts for their own sake. And we said any type of act that's done purely for its own sake, we call the kind of being at work. Apologize for my messy handwriting, even though I'm not writing on a board. But that happiness is related to leisure insofar as it's a kind of being at work, that you're doing acts for their own sake. But the idea is here, what kinds of acts are most worthy of being done for their own sake? Is chilling, relaxing worthy of being done for its own sake? Well, let's look at a text. If we go to Book 10, Chapter 6, here we see Aristotle discussing the nature of happiness and the nature in relationship to leisure and such. So I'll just start reading from the beginning. Now that the things having to do with the virtues, with friendship and the pleasures have been discussed, what remains is to go through and outline what has to do with happiness, since we set this down as the end at which humans aim. And the account of it would be shorter for those who take up again what has been said before. Now we said that happiness is not an active condition. In other words, happiness is not just a virtue, since it could then be present in someone who is asleep throughout life, living the life of a vegetable, or in someone suffering the greatest misfortunes. So if these consequences are not satisfactory, one ought instead to place happiness in some form of being at work, as in what was said before. And among the ways of being at work, some are necessary and some are chosen for the sake of something else, while others are for their own sake. It is clear that one ought to place happiness as one of those that are chosen for their own sake and not among those that are chosen for the sake of something else, since happiness stands in need of nothing but is self-sufficient. First thing that we want to point out, though, is this idea that happiness requires activity. It's not enough just to be virtuous. It's not enough just to be anything. You have to live a life that reflects what you are. You have to have an activity that comes from what you are. Now, what you are, the kind of being that you can have, ought to be a kind of virtue. It ought to be an activity of virtue. But it's not enough just to have virtue. You have to act it out. Now, the real question is what kinds of virtues, what kinds of activities should be done? And here we said that they should be for their own sake, they should be self-sufficient. Let's read a little more. And those activities are chosen for their own sake, from which nothing is sought beyond the being at work. And actions in accordance with virtue seem to be of this sort, since performing actions that are beautiful and serious is something chosen for its own sake. So here's this idea that when we're trying to see what the best life is, what kinds of activities are the best activities, he describes them as both beautiful and serious. What about how we use our leisure? Well, Aristotle has some interesting things. He talks about how we use our leisure, and I like the way he describes it as really a kind of play. If we go over here to 191, Aristotle says, therefore, happiness does not consist in play. For it would even be absurd for our end to be play, and to work hard and undergo troubles all through one's life for the sake of playing. For we choose everything, so to speak, for the sake of something else except happiness, since this is the end. But to be earnest and to labor for the sake of play seems foolish and too childish. So here's this idea that so much of even what we do, we seem to be saying, you know what, really what my life is about, it's about my playing, right? And what Aristotle says is that is not right. It may be about leisure, about something that's worthy of being done for its own sake, but it's not about playing. So what are these things that are most worthy of their own sake, most worthy of being done? Well, Aristotle says we're going to have to sort of, in order to understand that, we're going to have to look at what we are as human beings. Well, perhaps another candidate is virtue in general. Maybe virtues of character, right? Maybe the best kind of life would be to be generous, to be courageous, temperate, all these kinds of things. Well, Aristotle is going to say even these are not going to be the best types of virtues, and we'll see where they fit in a little bit. But a couple of reasons. But one of the most important reasons is that all these kinds of virtues are sort of presupposed. They're presupposed in any good life. You know, that it doesn't, anyone and everyone ought to have these virtues. And so perhaps they can participate in what happiness is. They're going to be part of what happiness is. If you're not generous, you're not courageous, you're not temperate, you're not these things, according to Aristotle, it would be nearly impossible for you to truly be happy because you're going to be constantly struggling and in your enjoyment of some of these most basic things. But that is not going to be just what happiness is. Happiness is more than just being generous and courageous, etc. And so what are these things? Well, in order to reveal this, we're going to have to say, what is a human being? And we talked about this before. What is the activity of a human being? And we said that to be human is to be a rational animal. And so the activities, the best kind of activities of us as human beings are going to come particularly from our rational part. And what we'll see is that according to Aristotle, there's two kind of uses of reason, two sort of domains of our reasoning. Sometimes when we're reasoning in a practical way, and sometimes when we're reasoning in a theoretical way. Theoretical. And so the first key thing here is to understand the difference between the theoretical and the practical use of reason. In practical reason, one of the easiest ways to distinguish these two is in terms of their goal. In practical reason, the goal is an action. The goal is to accomplish some end in action. In theoretical reason, the goal is understanding. You don't necessarily seek just to be able to do a particular thing or accomplish some particular goal, but your goal is itself to understand. Your goal is the activity of understanding itself. And so we could talk quite a lot about this, but let me try to do this quickly. Then when it comes to practical reason, then Aristotle asks, what's the highest use of our practical reason? What's the best thing we could use it for? Well, Aristotle will say the best use of our practical reason will be in a life of politics. Why politics? Well, if you think about what a politician is one whose activity is ordered towards the good of the community. They're acting to sort of bring about the good of the community. And that requires an incredible mastery of practical reasoning, not just in terms of the general principles. Remember when we distinguish general principles versus particular circumstances, but a politician has to sort of not only know the general principles, but know how to achieve that within the particular circumstances of that community. That's something that's incredibly difficult, an incredible rational task, but also something that's very worthy of being done. What is the ultimate good of the community? But it's happiness. And so seeking not just the happiness of yourself, but the happiness of an entire community is one of the best kinds of lives. According to Aristotle, if we were then to look at theoretical reasoning, what's the highest use of theoretical reasoning? Well, he's going to call that something like contemplation. Contemplation means, well, just really the activity of understanding. Now that probably doesn't sound very fun, because usually when you think of a word like contemplation, you might think of someone alone in a room all by themselves, just sort of thinking. You know, that's probably does not sound terribly fun. And even being a politician probably does not sound very fun. So we need to sort of understand these two ideas a little bit better. Well, let's go back to practical reasoning. What do we mean by practical reasoning? Well, a lot of the kinds of pursuits that we're pursuing, if you even think of your college careers, are fundamentally practical. Say you're studying to be a nurse, or even a psychologist, or a teacher, or business. If you're studying any of these fields, you're very likely you're focusing on very practical things. Your goal is particular actions and achieving particular goals through your education. If you're studying philosophy, or you're studying literature, you're studying history, you're studying even versions of mathematics, even some aspects of physics, your goal is just understanding. You're not necessarily trying to change anything about the world. You're not trying to accomplish any particular actions. You just want to understand. That's theoretical. Well, let's think about this. This idea of contemplating would seem kind of strange to us, again, because we sort of think that contemplating is just you alone in a room, just thinking about yourself. That certainly doesn't sound like the best life. So let me give you a couple examples. Well, first of all, I think that we all enjoy contemplating much more than you first realize. And I'll challenge you to this. What do you do for fun? Well, you probably go and might say, well, I hang out with my friends. Well, good. What do you do when you hang out with your friends? All sorts of things, but I guarantee you one of those things that you do is you talk. And one of the ways that you know who your best friends are is that you talk about the most meaningful things. You talk about the things that matter the most. Right? And you enjoy just the activity of talking about the things that matter most. That's how you kind of know that you are friends. What are you doing with that friend? You're contemplating. You're trying to understand the truth of things. And so one of the first things we see is that contemplation does not occur in isolation. This is not in isolation usually. Modern philosophy has sort of forced us into this idea that contemplation happens sort of by ourselves. But we'll see with Aristotle and Plato and these guys that contemplation is sort of occurring within a community of people. The second important thing here, though, is that when we talk about contemplation, we're not just talking about, just thinking with some people, that there's variations on contemplation that we do that are of different kinds. For instance, one of the most popular types of radio that exists is sports radio. A lot of people love talking about sports, and it seems to me that a lot of us probably enjoy talking about sports and arguing about sports more than even the sports themselves and watching the sports. So this is one of these interesting things that we do as well, that this idea of contemplation is really trying to understand something important, right? And the highest version of this, according to Aristotle, will be the contemplation of the highest kinds of questions, which, occurs in philosophy. But anything similar to this could sort of fall under this kind of contemplation. I would also argue that any time that you really enjoy something, that all of the arts, in particular, are really contemplative. When you think about your love of good music and good films, and, clearly physical art itself, these are all part of our contemplative activities, where we're not just seeing this thing, but we're enjoying it. Even food can become a kind of contemplative art, where it's not just creating something that tastes good, but you're actually appreciate the whole aesthetic of the thing. That what Aristotle is ultimately saying is this life of contemplation, of seeking understanding and sort of adoring things that are excellent, things that are kalon, right, is really the best kind of life that you can lead. And so when we go back to this question, what is the best kind of life? Well, it's going to be enjoying the best kinds of pleasures. The best kinds of pleasures will come from the best activities. And so you need to become the kind of person who can contemplate the most important kinds of things, and you'll be living the best kind of life, according to Aristotle.